And what up, everybody? Welcome back to Feral Publications YouTube channel. This channel talk about zines and DIY publishing. And this is the zine that I publish here. It's a comic book zine anthology with cartoonists, underground cartoonists, subversive cartoonists from all around the world. $20 for a 1-year subscription or $3 per issue. So peep it out if you guys want. There'll be a link in the show notes. So today I want to talk about the comic book industry, because YouTube is always watching what you watch to recommend more and reinforce more nonsense at times. And I saw this narrative of a lot of people with a lot of subscribers talking about how we need to rally to save comic books and all this nonsense. The argument is just so flawed for multiple reasons that I want to get into, because I don't want people to be discouraged or fear for sequential art. Like, sequential art is fine. Like, at that, I feel like sequential art is much better than it ever was. And like, if you ever thought about self-publishing, if you ever thought about making a zine, I would even argue that this is that moment to do so. So the first point was that comic books are dying, and that's not true. And a lot of them were kind of saying that the pandemic was one of the driving forces, and that's not true neither. So here's some information on that.
So this is the article that I saw by Forbes magazine. New sales data reveals how COVID-19 impacted comics industry. And what this article basically states is that graphic novels and comic book magazine sales have gone up during the pandemic. And I want to read a quote. It says, the COVID-19 pandemic predictably damaged the comics industry in the United States during its peak months, but the segment as a whole held up surprisingly well and even experienced significant growth in areas like manga and graphic novels for young readers. Graphic novels outperformed other book categories across trade book retail channels, seeing weekly gains of as much as 30% over 2019. Independent retailers suffered a major hit over the summer, but seem to have recovered ground lately thanks to adopting new sales strategies in the face of the pandemic and local restrictions.
Now, the other thing was that, like, comic books need to get away from superheroes.
And here goes an article saying the comic book industry is dying. Does this signal the end of superheroes? And the tagline is, in the 1980s, the comic book industry saw a sharp increase in revenue owing to the rise in popularity of superheroes, which is not accurate because most comic historians say it was the black and white boom and creator-owned comics that really made comic books come to the forefront.
The other point that they kept making was that there's an oversaturation of superhero comics. And the reality is that says more about you as a reader than it does sequential art or the comic book industry, right? Because we're living in an age where things like Feral Ciomics is actually doing well. You know what I mean? This comic book that literally is just random madness from the minds of different cartoonists. Like, who would have thought fucking 20 years ago that would even be a possibility? When you think of something like Red Room is not a superhero comic, and that's probably the most anticipated comic book dropping this moment. There are so many comic books that are outside of the superhero genre that people just don't give a fuck about. You know what I mean? And going back to that point of, like, this is more about you as a reader than it does sequential art. That just means that you are ultimately a DC and Marvel fanboy rather than sequential art lover, right? Because there are so many great comic books that I just absolutely love, and they're not superhero comics. Not to say that I don't dabble in superhero comics, because I also enjoy a good superhero comic story, but, like, the idea that sequential art is nothing but that is just, it's ludicrous to me. It's just, and then DC was owned by Warner, is now owned by Discovery. I don't know. I don't give a fuck, to be honest. And, you know, like, they're fine. Like, they're not going nowhere. So they're saying that there's less comic books being sold. And I think that this might actually be true. That is true. That's accurate. But it's being quantified, I think, in a very negative way, right? The way you should be quantifying this is how much money is being brought back into the comic book industry. How much money is being brought back into comic books, right? And comic book creators. And the reality is like, in 2018, I think it was over $850 million.
And I pulled that number from this article here from Inc. magazine, which was written by Larry Alton. And it's called, Want to Turn Your Comic Book Idea into a $1 million Business? Here's the first steps. And in it, he also talks about how this is literally just the money made from direct sales to retailers and to comic book readers, but it doesn't talk about the money made through intellectual property for the acquisition, for making movies, merchandise, and video games. And you can see here that it was estimated $865 million. And like I said, not the peripheral of like YouTubing, TikToking, T-shirts, toys, and things like that. But just straight up comic book sales, 865 million.
And it kind of goes back to something that Todd McFarlane was talking about on Cartoonist Kayfabe and other places, was this idea that Image, or even the Image Revolution documentary, he talks about that same thing of like, he came to this conclusion of, if he's only getting 25% of the sales of the comic books that he's making for Marvel and for DC, then he only needs to sell 25% of that quantity in order to publish himself and be successful and maintain the same livelihood. And that's what I don't think people are understanding, that Marvel and DC sales may be down, but there are more creator-owned properties, there are more self-published comics, there are more independent presses than there used to be. There's a resurgence of that. And that's why I was telling you guys, if you ever thought about doing that, this might be that moment to do that. Because we live in a world where like you have webtoons, and you have Amazon Kindle, and you have Xerox and Mix, like you have all kinds of print shops that will print your comic book for you, that will bound your graphic novel for you. And you have direct consumer market now where like if you build your own audience, kind of like Feral Publication has done through YouTube and Instagram and all these things, where I've built my own audience. And so when I drop a new zine, this audience that supports what I'm doing, that supports the art that I create, are finding me and purchasing that. And so in that way, even though I only get a few sales every month, but that money directly goes to me and to my project. And so in that way, even though there's less issues being sold, there's still a massive amount of money going into the comic book industry. So once again, the reality of it is, sequential art in comic book industry, I think, is probably in one of the best moments it's ever been in. And that's why I feel like Feral Comics has been growing, is because we're in this wave, this surgence of like anti-Marvel and DC comics. I don't think Marvel and DC comics are going to be defining the bar anymore. I think they haven't for a long time. And for a lot of people that really like sequential art, we've been aware of that for a long time. But I think that the mass majority of people that just jumped into comic books, that people that just started liking comics because of the TV shows and the movies and all that, I think they're starting to realize like, hey, I don't think there's much to these comic book companies anymore. It's like, no, there's not. Why do I think we're living in a perfect moment for comic book creators? It's because it's being diversified. It's out of the hands of like private labels. It's out of the hand of like these big companies. This literally has become a working class kind of community. Whereas before you had to hope that you can break into one of the big twos to make a livelihood. Now like you can do this on your own. You can. So is Marvel and DC gonna die? I honestly do think so. I think that their comic book publishing is gonna fade away. And at the end of the day, they're going to be movies formerly known as comic books. Because the reality is, now that we're living in an area of creator-owned properties, and we're living in an area where, you know, like revenue streams have been diversified, so that you can make your own comic book and sustain yourself off of YouTube, off of TikTok, and all these other streams of revenue, that ultimately in the end, you don't need to work for DC or Marvel. And you don't need to create intellectual property that you won't own anymore. And because of that, also because they don't want to create new characters, because they don't want to credit, or they don't want to give royalty, or they don't want to have to deal with all those creators, what ends up happening is that, how many times can you tell a story with the same characters before you're kind of over it, right? The DC and Marvel world isn't growing, it isn't expanding, because they can't allow it to, because then they would have to pay the creators of those characters. And so these executives in suits don't want to create new characters, and if they did, I'm sure they would be hella stagnant. It would be dead. It would be flat, because they're not excited about creating these characters, these stories, these narratives. And because of that, like, think about Marvel and DC. Someone like me that's a fan of comics, I can't think of one artist that I give a fuck about that currently is working for Marvel and DC. As Marvel and DC die, you're going to see other companies, better companies, I think, that are bringing in this new model that we need to see at the moment. When you think of something like Image, where Image is more of a distribution company that doesn't own your property but helps you distribute your property, that's a killer. When you think of Fantagraphics with Red Room, I think Red Room probably will be one of the most important comic books this year, dare I say the next 5-10 years. Because that really has flipped it on its head, where it's probably one of the most anticipated comic books, probably one of the ones that people have generally gone out and asked for. And it isn't a superhero comic book. It's not by one of the major labels. It's not even by Image. Some people think that Image is still underground, but Image is hella mainstream to me, right? It's by Fantagraphics. As Marvel and DC die from the comic book scene, you're gonna see companies like all these companies that have rallied and just like rooted for creator-owned properties taking the forefront and really just becoming these kind of distribution companies for small creators. You're gonna see new companies like Feral Publication growing that as well and being part of that new surge, that new energy in sequential art. So when people are telling you like comic book industry is hurting, all this other shit, that shit is nonsense, homie. Like I said, this was a rant more about the comic book industry just because it's what I'm into. It's what I publish and what I hope to grow into, right? Like I said, like Feral Comics right now, the plan is to try to get into some comic book shops, and like we're just gonna keep pushing this and growing this, you guys. So thank you for letting me rant. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Lates.